What comes to mind when you hear the phrase or the word untouchable? I can't help but thinking of various societies with specific social strata or caste systems where certain individuals are just so low on the totem pole, if you will, that it would be considered dishonorable and disgusting to even be near or brush against such a person. But there's another sense in which we could use that phrase, although it's interesting that I guess we could probably connect the two in an interesting way in another lesson. The other way we could use this phrase is not that something is so low, so disgusting, and I'm not saying that's an accurate description in those systems, but not that something is so untouchable in a bad sense, but that something is untouchable in the sense that it is so far above us, that it is so pure, that it is so holy, that we cannot, should not, must not touch it. That's what I want us to talk about for a few minutes this morning. Specifically, I want us to talk about a man who built something untouchable. I'm sure you have heard the name Bezalel many, many, many times in sermons and lessons throughout the years. No? Oh, okay. We don't hear about Bezalel very much, but that's who we're going to talk about this morning. Bezalel was the man who built what we might rightly describe as the most untouchable object in human history. We're talking about the Ark of the Covenant, the place where the mercy seat was in the Holy of Holies, where God's presence dwelt. That had to be built. That did not always exist, and unlike the original tablets upon which the law was written, God did not just give them to the people of Israel, which is an interesting consideration in itself. He certainly could have, but he didn't. He had someone build it. So I want us to think about this individual. And we need to ask the question as we begin to think about him, who was he? Who was this man who is considered worthy to build the very throne, in a physical sense, at that time, of God? Now, of course, as we have even been talking about in Revelation, there is no physical throne or dwelling place that God literally resides in or literally resided in at that time. His glory, his presence is what is described there, not his physical being, even though he doesn't have a physical being, right? It gets tricky when we start talking about that. But nevertheless, who was this individual that built such a holy object? Well, we're told in Exodus chapter 31, after God has given all these descriptions to Moses about the tabernacle, about its design, about how it is to be structured, about how it is to be constructed, surely in Moses' mind, one of the things that's going on is, how are we going to accomplish this? We don't have exactly a whole lot of people who are used to working with these kind of things. Remember, the Israelites were bottom of the totem pole, ironically, when it came to Egyptian society. They were coming out of very menial slavery. Now, if you think about, for example, the Roman system, I'm speaking a little bit in ignorance here, but I think it's accurate. The Roman system, I am for sure about this, the Roman system of slavery, many, many, many decades and centuries down the road, they would have a lot of skilled craftsmen as slaves who were able to use a lot of different tools and techniques and so forth. But at least based on the description we have of the Israelites, this is where I'm not 100% sure, I'm just basing it on the description of the Israelites in Exodus. It doesn't seem like the Israelites had this whole spectrum of unskilled to skilled labor that they were assigned to. It seems, at least based on the description, they were pretty much all the unskilled labor, the kind of bottom of the totem pole, even among slaves. So you can imagine Moses kind of beginning to question, well, how is this going to work? We don't exactly have high-end craftsmen. We aren't exactly used to having gold and silver and anything like that at our disposal. So after giving all these intricate descriptions of how the tabernacle is to be constructed, God solves this problem. He says to Moses in Exodus 31, "See, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God." Now, remember, we're talking about the object that is going to go in the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest once a year can enter. And yet, you notice something about Bezalel? He's not the high priest. He's not Aaron. He's not a son of Aaron. He's not a priest at all. He's not even a Levite. And yet this is the one who God says, "I have called him." Him specifically. God didn't put a wanted ad in the paper and say, "Anyone who wants this job, sign up and I'll give you my Spirit to be able to accomplish this task." No, he picked. And he picks this guy. We're not told a whole lot about this guy, but that isn't really strange for God, is it? Just picking someone at random. At least to us, it seems random. Remember a few centuries down the road when the Midianites are oppressing Israel? And God has the opportunity to pick someone to deliver Israel. He doesn't pick one of the leading families. He doesn't pick, for example, one of the descendants of Caleb, who was this amazing hero of Israel. He doesn't pick one of his descendants. He appears to this man named Gideon, who is shaking with fear as he hides grain from the oppressors so that maybe he'll have a little bit to eat. And as the angel of the Lord appears to him and says, "Hey, I picked you," Gideon's response is, "I'm the last of the last. I'm the weakest of the weak. I'm the least of my father's house. My father's house is the weakest in the clan. The clan is the weakest in Manasseh. Manasseh is one of the weakest in Israel," right? And God says, "Well, I still pick you." Now, again, we don't know a whole lot about Bezalel and his connections within the tribe of Judah, but at least from our perspective, it's kind of a nobody. And yet God picked him. Of course, that was the same way, if you will, that the people around the first century in Judea and Galilee saw Jesus himself. It's different, of course. Jesus wasn't picked in the same way, but he also chose not to come into the world as a king's son, not to come into the world as one of the higher-ups, not to come into the world as a prominent Pharisee's son. No, the people around him said, "Isn't this the carpenter's son?" Interesting, by the way, that Jesus' father was also a craftsman, just like Bezalel was called to be a craftsman. Is not his mother called Mary? Are not his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, Judas? God doesn't need someone with social status. He just needs the one that he chooses to get the job done. We know almost nothing about Bezalel, except we know he was not a Levite. He didn't come from any of the circles you would expect for him to come from, at least from what we can tell, from what we're told. But we also know God chose him by name. So let's ask the question then. Why was he allowed to touch the ark? We're talking about something that is untouchable. We're talking about something that no one is allowed to even approach the presence of except for the high priest. Well, to be fair, there are a couple of practical reasons. Notice what we're told in Exodus chapter 37, as we actually get to the description of Bezalel building this thing. He makes the ark of acacia wood. He overlays it with pure gold inside and out, makes a molding of gold around it. Now, let's just stop for a minute. As is reiterated over and over and over again, both in the Old Testament and the New, is there anything sacred about wood in and of itself? Anything sacred about gold? Anything even before it is consecrated for God's use? Anything even sacred about the physical object itself? Somehow you make it in a certain way and all of a sudden it's magical? No. No, what makes it important is what God does with it. What makes this insignificant thing important is the purpose that God sets for it. Now that's interesting, isn't it? But notice, it was very plain after the thing was constructed that no one is allowed to touch it. We remember probably the story of Uzzah, a tragedy, and it is intended, as it is written in 2 Samuel, to be a tragedy. We should read it and be very upset at what happens on multiple levels. They're transporting the Ark of the Covenant because it's been captured. They're transporting it by ox cart, which, by the way, was not at all how it was supposed to be transported, but they transport it by the ox cart. And as they're transporting it, they've been very careful, it seems, to this point, not to touch it. You can imagine how hard it would be, especially those of y'all who have tried to strap down things on trucks and stuff like that. Imagine how hard it would be to secure something on an ox cart like that without being able to touch it. So they secured it as best they could, it seems, but they didn't secure it well enough, because as the oxen are stumbling, it starts to tilt. Looks like it's going to fall over. Imagine the disaster in the minds of Israel, certainly, that it would be if the Ark of the Covenant falls and perhaps even breaks. And so to prevent this, Uzzah reaches out and touches it to try and steady it. I would venture to guess he doesn't even think twice about it. It's just an instinct, right? If you see a large object falling next to you that you're trying to transport, well, obviously, the first thing I do is reach out and touch it, steady it. But it's untouchable. You are not allowed, beyond not allowed, this is something that no human being is capable, almost, if you will. Oh, he does it, but you've just touched the most holy object in the world. And so God strikes Uzzah down. It might remind us of how we're told we cannot see God. No human being can bear even to see the essence, the glory of God. It would literally kill us. Well, it's kind of the same way with the ark. That's what it represented. That's the function that it served. But we do need to take account of the fact that when Bezalel is making the ark, it hasn't been consecrated yet. That's what happens at the end of Exodus. They take the anointing oil, they anoint the tabernacle, they anoint all this in, all the furniture, so that all of it becomes holy. It's not actually holy until it's consecrated. So before then, it's just wood and gold. So now we're like, well, okay, if it's not holy yet, what's the big deal? Okay, this guy made this thing, but it's not holy until it's consecrated. On a practical level, yeah, someone has to build it if God's not going to make it himself. Someone has to touch it to build it. You can't build it without touching it. It was consecrated later. But think about what this says about Bezalel himself. Of all the people who could be picked to build something that would become utterly untouchable, what does that say about Bezalel? You might remember a few months ago we talked about Rhoda, the slave girl, who is so overjoyed to hear that Peter has been released from prison. And we talked about, although we're not really told anything about her either, what does that say about her and about Peter? That she, a slave girl, was overjoyed to hear that this friend of her master's had been released from prison. In the same way, what does it say about Bezalel? No, he wasn't touching something that had already been consecrated. That would have been wrong. After he builds the ark, well, no, he's not going to be allowed to touch it after that, after it's been built, been consecrated. But God still chose him. So let's think about something as we put all these pieces together. What was Bezalel's legacy? Think about Bezalel's children and grandchildren as they sit around his feet and he tells them of the time where he built something that no one is now allowed even to see, much less touch. Think about all of the things that happen because there is this object that is infused, in a sense, with the holiness and glory of God that Israel can now carry with them. And he can, even though he can never see it with his own eyes again, can think back and say, I'm the one who God chose to make that possible. Now, did God have to do it that way? Did God have to have an Ark of the Covenant in the first place? No. But that's how he chose to do it. And Bezalel was the one who was chosen to make it. Notice what the Hebrews writer says. There are priests who offer gifts according to the law. He's kind of wrapping up a summary of all these different elements of the old law. And he says, notice, they serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. Now, if you go in more detail in Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews tells us very clearly that all of the old system, especially the imagery that was employed in the tabernacle and all the different objects in the tabernacle, all those physical objects, all those physical dimensions and all those things, they were meant to foreshadow spiritual ideas, spiritual concepts, spiritual truths. They were copies, shadows of heavenly things. Not in the sense that there are physical objects in heaven somehow. We've dealt with that in multiple different ways, a great deal. They are meant to convey spiritual truths. So you realize what that means. That means part of Bezalel's legacy was not just providing for this ark, this box, this object in which the glory of God dwelt. Not just providing for this thing that represented the presence of God with his people. He also made possible a foreshadowing of something far greater. Something he would never know about. Not at least on this side of eternity. Remember what happens at the end of Jesus' life? Jesus is on the cross. We have several interactions between him, the disciples, the mockers, the thieves on the cross, all these different things. But finally, his life ends. He cries out with a loud voice one last time, breathes his last breath, at least before his resurrection. And you remember what happens next? The curtain, the veil, that separates the holy place, where the priest could go, from the most holy place, where only the high priest can go, and only once a year, that veil is torn. Torn without hands, torn from the top to the bottom. It's pretty high up. So if it's torn from the bottom to the top, maybe a human did it. If it's torn from the top to the bottom, that's the work of God. What does that veil represent? It represents a degree of separation between the most holy and everything else. A degree of something being veiled. Remember Moses' face when he comes down from Sinai after he has been in the presence of God, after he has, to a limited degree, experienced the glory of God. He has to veil his face because of his brilliance. Once again, because God is untouchable. because that which is made holy by his presence is untouchable. Therefore, this veil is there ultimately not to keep people out because of some mean-spirited aspect of God's nature. It's for our protection, or for their protection. And yet, with Jesus' death, with that reconciling blood being shed, what does that do? It removes the separation. It removes the separation from the presence of God. And what represented that presence? Well, it was that Ark of the Covenant, which resided in the Holy of Holies so many centuries after Bezalel constructed it from wood and gold. That's a legacy. We think about the contribution that he made, that this individual that we really know nothing about. This is the only description we're ever given of him. He's mentioned one other time, I believe it's in Chronicles, just hearkening back to this construction. We're never told anything about him, his family, his personality. All we're told is he's the guy who built the ark and the temple, tabernacle, or not the temple, the tabernacle, all these things in it. But he's recorded for us. God could have just said, oh yeah, I've appointed someone, didn't have to name him. Could have talked about all the things being built. But no, he wanted us to know. Why? I think it goes back to the principle that Jesus speaks about in Matthew 10. He says there to the crowds and to his disciples, whoever gives one of these little ones, talking about essentially someone who would come to him in faith, whoever gives one of these little ones even a cup of cold water because he is a disciple, truly I say to you, he will by no means lose his reward. As we begin to close, I want you to think about who this man was. Because he wasn't anyone you've heard of. Why haven't we heard, why haven't we talked more about Bezalel? At this time in Israel's history, who do we think of? Moses, maybe Aaron, Joshua. We think about these people who did these big things, right? We talk about the people who conquered Canaan. We talk about the people who parted the Red Sea. And yet, while yes, God certainly talks about them plenty, he made sure Bezalel's name was in there too. How much of the Old Testament changes if there is no Ark of the Covenant? Again, I'm not saying God couldn't have done it a different way. But if he's going to do it this way, someone has to build it. Someone has to do that job. Now, it's not as glorious as being the high priest. It's not as glorious as being the one who goes up on Sinai to receive the law. It doesn't get as much recognition as the one who leads the army into battle. But it was still essential. It was still necessary. It still left a legacy that even to this day cannot be undone because of the purpose it fulfilled, not just under the old law, but as foreshadowing what we see now and helping us to understand what we have now by the figure, by the image that it creates for us. That's a legacy. We've probably never heard of this guy. Probably if you saw his name in the Bible, if you even read it instead of skipping over it, because it's real easy to skip over these hard names, probably you just read it and said, oh, I've never heard that name before. Don't see a lot of people lining up to name their child Bezalel. But his work has forever impacted God's people for good. It was just craftsmanship. It was just, in a sense, paid labor, as we might think of it. But because he did it for the Lord, as the Lord instructed, using his ability, in this case, ability God gave him directly, it accomplished something that no one else accomplished. It accomplished something that had lasting value. I hope we're seeing the significance of this for us. This one individual was chosen in a way that God doesn't choose anymore, but nonetheless chosen out of all God's people to serve in a unique way. Now think about that. Most of us that are in this room, we're not going to do anything huge, at least as the world counts huge, in the kingdom of God. Most of us, if not all of us, will probably not be keynote speakers at huge lectureships. We're not necessarily going to be someone who brings thousands of people to Christ. We're not necessarily going to be the people who bring the gospel to a country where it's never gone before. We're not necessarily going to be the people who have Bible studies multiple times a week and are converting all these different people. We're not necessarily going to be the people who are able to work with children who have lost everything and be able to get scores of them into a stable position. We're not necessarily going to be the people who can help hundreds of widows to get back on their feet. Most of us aren't going to be those people. Most of us are not going to be a Moses, a Joshua, an Aaron. And you know what? That's okay. In fact, it's more than okay. It's how it's supposed to be. Because as much as God needs those Moses and Aaron and Joshua figures, He also needs Bezalels too. Oh, and we can name so many other people. So many people that are mentioned once or twice in Scripture. And so many people that we never hear in sermons and lessons, that we skip over as we read through Scripture. And yet they left a legacy that was irreplaceable. Even if it seems small. God doesn't ask you to do as much as fill in the blank. God asks you to do what you have the opportunity to do. And if you use what ability God has given you, if you take what opportunities God has provided for you, you get to leave a legacy too. No, most of the church probably won't ever know your name. I don't mean most of the church here. I mean most of the church throughout the world. Probably won't be a household name in most Christian homes. Probably won't meet most people who are trying to follow Christ. But you'll be remembered by God. Because you contributed what He allowed you to contribute. Rather than, as Jesus would say in one of His most famous parables, burying what He's given you in the ground. Just because it's not big in our eyes doesn't mean it's not big in God's. You and I have an opportunity very similar to Bezalel's in God's kingdom today. But only you can decide to take that opportunity, to use it for the kingdom. If there's any way we can encourage or help you in that, or in any other thing you may be struggling with this morning, please let us know as we stand and sing together.
Have you been to Jesus for the cleansing power of